Now, our next speaker is Bob Sorensen. So Bob is the SVP and Research and Chief Analyst for Quantum Computing at Hyperion Research. Unfortunately, Bob could not make it in person. So the powers that be decided that he couldn't travel, even though he really wanted to. So he apologizes to everybody for not being here in person. We already have a pre-recording of Bob's talk, and we're going to play that back here in just a second. I did want to say about this talk, this is a very interesting talk. Actually, Q2B got together with QEDC and QUIC, which is the European equivalent of QEDC for those that might not know this. And we got together and decided basically to go to Bob together and ask him to put together this market overview, essentially do an extensive polling of the market. He probably has reached out to many people that are here in this room today and talked to the different software vendors and hardware vendors and figure out how they're doing. How big is the market that they're addressing? What are the different applications? And what is happening today? And how do they see the future, right? So it's a very important initiative, we feel, and thank you to everybody that's here that has responded to the poll. And we also decided to make this a recurring thing, right? So with these market research studies, you don't want to have just like one data point, right? You want to be able to have multiple of these data points and basically be able to detect the trends. We all know the market is growing. We've seen it, right, through everything that's happening in the show and everything that's happening in the news. But what we've done is basically already are committed to doing this every year annually at Q2B. So this is original content. It's the first time that's going to be presented is right now. And we're going to make this presentation and this report available to every attendee. It's going to be publicly available on our website. It's going to take us a few weeks before we actually do that. But we're eventually going to get it. So without further ado, let's switch over to the video and let's hear it from Bob.
Hi, how you doing? Good morning. I'm Bob Sorensen. I'm the Chief Analyst for Quantum Computing here at Hyperion Research. I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the work that we have been doing over the last 3 or 4 months with the intent, if you will, of sizing the global quantum computing market landscape. First off, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for allowing me to contribute remotely, as travel at this point was not an option for me. And I hope that an MP4 file can adequately replace me being there in person. So we'll do our best. So quickly, Hyperion Research is a market research company. We look at advanced computing writ large, traditional high-performance computers, artificial intelligence in the HPC environment, and of course, quantum computing. Basically, all sorts of technologies that work to accelerate the advanced computing workloads of important science and engineering applications around the world. Well, this particular Market Landscape 2021 project is part of our now continuing series of efforts to capture global QC market dynamics. Essentially, the target audience for something like this is we want to make sure that quantum computing developers who are interested in market dynamics and what's happening in the sector have the best available information to make their decisions. Likewise, with national policymakers tasked with QC-related decisions for R&D, procurement, policy on education, workforce development, trade, and other national security considerations. Also, we want to make sure that new and potential QC users in both the advanced computing and enterprise spaces have access to the best possible information about the dynamics within the sector, who are looking to gauge the progress to understand where they can best insert themselves into this new sector. And finally, we want to make sure that funding sources, both commercial in the corporate and venture capital space, really understand the technology and some of the market potential that quantum computing hardware and software developers offer at this particular point in time. So let me give you a roadmap of the project as it worked its way through the process. Ultimately, the goal here was to build a global estimate from a data-driven perspective. We really wanted to make sure that we were talking to the right people and gathering the right data when it came to this market forecast. So really what we did is we conducted a QC supplier survey to gather data and insights on QC market dynamics. Now, the key theme of this particular activity this year was to expand the survey of the coverage over last year, and we wanted to include many more non-US players. So I have to give my first thanks to the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, the US-based industry consortium that helped me reach out to a number of US-based quantum computing suppliers, but also to the QUIC, the Quantum Industry Consortium in the EU, the QUIC, the Quantum Industry of Canada Consortium, as well as Austrade, for assistance in helping us reach out to their domestic QC supplier base. And you'll see we had much more aggressive and active participation from a global perspective this year versus last year. So once we had those names, we sent out a simple 20-question survey to those identified suppliers, and we gathered the results. And the one thing we wanted to ensure was things like geographic diversity, company size, both total company size and revenues, and QC-related revenues, as well as market concentration and other aspects, which we'll cover in a few minutes. Ultimately, we were able to analyze results from 152 different respondents to help us build our data-driven market projection. And that projection will be copiously documented with initial conditions, assumptions, and caveats. So it's pretty clear to anyone looking at this how we reached our conclusion. Well, let's jump immediately right now to our executive summary. And the bottom line here is that based on what we've seen in last year's survey and this one, there's continued strong growth for the global quantum computing sector. And so based on a study of 112 quantum computing suppliers, and I'll tell you in a minute why that number is different from the number I just gave you, based on those 112 suppliers from around the world, the estimated global quantum computing market will be worth about $490 million US in 2021. The anticipated CAGR, the compound aggregate growth rate for that sector between 2021 and 2024 is a strong 21.9%, which leads us to an estimated global quantum computing market in 2024 worth about $900 million US. One of the results of the survey that jumps out very quickly is looking at the data is that the quantum computing supplier base today is dominated by a few larger players. Indeed, 49% of the companies that we surveyed had less than $500,000 in revenues estimated in 2021, and 7% had more than $10 million of revenue. Another aspect of the sector we found is that cloud access models continue to dominate, at least for the next 3 years, where quantum computing suppliers we surveyed indicated that the way they saw the market breaking out by revenue was about 43% of that revenue would come from cloud access revenues, while hybrid on-prem and cloud access would come from about 21%, leading to about 2/3 of the market touching in some capacity a cloud access model. Interesting enough, our most promising market segments were the research community within the quantum computing world, which makes a lot of sense. It's still a very R&D intensive phenomena, which means that people need access to quantum computers to basically become more sophisticated in designing their own quantum computing hardware and software. Interestingly enough, cybersecurity, which was the topic we really hadn't even considered as recently as a few years ago, has now become one of the second most interesting aspects of the quantum computing market segment, followed by finance, academic, and then commercial and chemistry sector. We'll get into a little more of those details as we go along. But first off, I want to give you a little sense of the characteristics of the suppliers that we did speak to, just so you can get a sense of who we talked to and where they came from. As I said, we had 152 survey responses, which gave us a wide base of commercial QC organizations. But some of those instances were multiple responses from a single company. And we felt it was fair to not overrepresent those multiple responses. And what we did is we ultimately would combine them into a single company specific response. What was interesting is that most of the corporate responses we got from a single company were really quite similar, which made us feel good because we felt that the people we were talking to were in a condition to know exactly what was going on in the company. So there was not a lot of divergence when we got, say, 2 or 3. And I think in one case, we actually got 4 respondents from one single company. But once we removed those duplicates, we had that 112 distinct commercial organizations represented in the study. As you see here below, the headquarters locations of those studies has a much greater global participation than we had last year. 62 respondents from North America, 34 from Europe. We had 14 in Asia Pacific and 2 from the Middle East and Africa. When we asked these suppliers what their development activities were, and here they were allowed to select all that applied, we found that the preponderance were looking at algorithmic theoretical research, followed by software research and software product development. You'll see that hardware research and hardware product development is a smaller percentage, which in some sense makes sense simply because the amount of money and technical requirements needed to roll out a hardware product versus a software product much more onerous at this particular stage of development. But what this gives you is a sense that we did talk to a wide range of different organizations who are involved in supplying quantum computing at some level. Just to give you a sense of the related revenues of the companies that we spoke to, and these numbers are very similar to what we saw last year, except with some general overall increase, general creep among all of the different buckets that we surveyed, as I said earlier, we found that a significant percentage are in the no sale, still in the early research or development stage, as well as those companies that have less than $500,000 worth of sales. We did come across a number of companies that had between $25 and $50 million worth of sales. None that we felt had more than $50 million of QC-related revenues. When we asked them about how they saw those revenues change in the next 12 months, could you estimate potential growth rates of your companies? You'll see that there was a lot of optimism. The largest respondent set saw their basic revenues by increasing by more than 25%, but generally almost no companies saw any kind of significant decrease except in some single-digit coverages, which is a natural phenomena in a robust new technology sector such as quantum. But the overall tone that comes from this is that of the companies that we surveyed, strong revenue growth is anticipated. We're going to dive a little bit more into these numbers when we move closer into the format of what we use to actually build this particular market forecast. Well, one of the keys here is that we did is you'll notice when we ask revenues, it's usually much easier to get reliable responses from organizations. If you don't ask them their exact dollar amount, you basically put them into these buckets. And so the part of this, the guesswork that you hope comes out is, do you have the right buckets that people can really deal with? So what we had from some of those earlier slides was we had revenue buckets for the 112 companies that we talked to, and we estimated in some sense how those companies were represented within those distinct revenue buckets. And, it should come to no surprise that the obvious choice here would be, for example, companies that were in the $5 to $10 million bucket. We just assumed the average company in there had $7.5 million worth of revenue. So now that we had average bucket size revenues and the number of companies that were in that particular bucket, we were able to say that the quantum revenue base represented in the survey was about $417 million. Now, some of the key assumptions that we did here, in addition to that, the selecting center of buckets, was we had to remove a few non-direct QC suppliers from the survey, simply because we felt that they were not customer-facing organizations, but were rather part of the quantum computing supplier infrastructure. So we did have to take them. And there were a few proprietary suppliers that didn't give us estimates, but were significant enough within the market that we felt we needed to include them in an estimate, which is why some of our numbers here had to have a little bit of estimates for some of the larger companies that had, we felt, significant participation in the sector. And the other thing is, because we wanted to get the numbers up and really include the don't know, not sures, we gave them our known average number. In other words, when we took the average, we brought those companies into the fold, if you will, simply because we just estimated what those different numbers would be for those don't know, not sure companies. And as I said earlier, that uses a total revenue of about $417 million for the 112 organizations that we spoke to. Now, when we want to assess the total market size, what we had to do is make some assumptions here again. So we made the rather large assumption, and I'll talk about a little bit in a second about why we're okay with this number, is that we concluded that this particular study covers about 85% of the global commercial quantum computing revenue base. One of the reasons that we're confident about this number is it's certainly higher than the estimate we had to make last year due to the increased coverage in the EU and the Asia Pacific regions. We also felt that we had very strong representation from the major global QC suppliers. Although I can't share exactly who the companies were that participated in the survey because of our confidentiality agreement, I was able to ascertain that the major players, the usual suspects, if you will, that you would like to see in a survey like this, were accurately represented, at least to the best of our ability to figure that out. And really what we concluded then, that most of the non-surveyed organizations that are not included in this study likely had revenues in 2021 of less than $1 million. So if we're off, or if we're missing some number of companies, we are strongly convinced that the ones that were not included in the survey this year had lower revenues than in a position to severely affect our estimate of total market size. The key takeaway here, though, is that if you were not in this study this year, let us know. We would love to include you in the next year's study. We actually have already received funding to make sure that this is an annual Q2B event, and I'll be back next year and the year after that. And if the cards work out right, the year after that. So if you are not included in the study, we want your participation regardless of your revenue base. But please let us know if you want to be involved. We take those assumptions, we do the math quite simply. That's where we got that estimated 2021 you see global market revenue of about $490 million. Once we had the size, we wanted to really think about growth. Now, if you remember correctly, we asked every company about what their projected revenue growth was. And to be quite honest, after some reflection, the idea of saying, well, 25 companies said that their growth would increase by more than 25% isn't a really satisfying way to attack the problem, simply because if I'm making $500,000 a year with a 25% growth rate, that simply can't account as much as if I'm making $50 million a year and I expect a 25% increase over the year. So what we did is we broke out each company as it fell into each bucket. That allowed us to build a bucket by bucket growth size, so we could project out much more accurately and with a certain degree of precision exactly how the market would grow based on how the perceived growth rates of companies based on their existing revenue base would increase. And with all that said, that leads us to a 2021-2022 market growth rate of about 21.9%, or about 22% CAGR, at least for the next 3 years. So now we have the market size for 2021, and we had a CAGR growth rate that we believe will carry over not only into 2022, but certainly due to the sake of momentum, 2023, and perhaps going forward. But we'll be able to verify some of these numbers as we go forward next year. Now, I just want to show something. This is not showing off. This was pure serendipity. When we did the survey last year, we were instead of asking companies what their growth rates were in 2020, we said, what happened in 2019? So what you see is the light blue bars are the 2019 estimates that we made public last year. So you can see in 2019, we were looking at about a $300 million revenue base, 381, and so on. Well, when we take our estimates that we did for this year and just merge the two together, it is somewhat satisfying that the numbers do somewhat fall into sync, considering how we had to change the estimates, how we had to change our collection regime, how we expanded our coverage to much more globally perspective, and also how we saw the market projecting forward. So this is a relatively satisfying result here, and this is where you see where we get that almost $900 million sale based on that 21.9% CAGR. So this in some sense is really how we see the quantum computing market moving forward, say, at least for the next 2 to 3 years. Now, if we want to dive down a little bit and kind of dissect some of the specifics within the market, we did ask a number of other questions of our 112 quantum computing suppliers around the world. And we asked them about things like, how do you see the quantum computing market segment out by, say, revenue? And here where we see some numbers where in the next 36 months or so, quantum computing hardware and software revenues will actually be about the same. We include software in terms of the application space and some of the middleware that will go into making sure that application software runs on quantum systems. We see the quantum computing hardware, both on-prem and cloud-based, will compose of about a quarter of the market, and some of the cloud-based accesses, the money paid by end users to some kind of cloud service offering, whether it be through a major cloud service provider or some of the on-site company cloud service access models, will be about 16%. So this is really how the market segments out. And one of the things that we're looking for, I think, with a certain amount of interest here is this idea of quantum computing professional support and services. The idea is that because there is not a plethora of in-house quantum computing expertise within the potential user base, both in the advanced HPC world and enterprise IT, we expect to see a growing sense of professional services. The idea that a company that wants to get into quantum computing will go out and hire a consulting firm that will do all the heavy lifting to bring the quantum computing hardware and software into the business or research cycle within that company and then move away. So we're looking very interesting with what's going on in quantum computing professional support services and such going forward. So when we asked, again, this is what we talked about in the executive summary, the access method by revenue. As I said before, if you look at cloud access, it will dominate. If you look at all cloud access and hybrid combination of on-prem and cloud quantum computing capabilities, that will be the predominant way that users are accessing quantum computing capabilities, say, in the next 3 years at least. If we asked a little bit about algorithms, what are some of the algorithms that if you look at from a revenue perspective, certainly things like machine learning and optimization are leading. This is what we saw last year when we did the survey, and this is what we hear from a number of our user bases. But as we started to send out the survey, we got lots of comments back about other processes that we should be thinking about. Monte Carlo we were asked to insert that as an option for what's going on, and that actually is almost about 10% of the perceived algorithm of choice going forward in the next few years. And cybersecurity popped up at almost 14%, almost equaling both mod sim and optimization when it comes to potential algorithmic generation of revenue. That cybersecurity aspect was one of the most interesting surprises that we came up with as we conducted this particular exercise. Now, when we asked each of the vendors which are the most promising applications, which is the top one, this is really just kind of another way to look at it, but to really scale the diversity from an application perspective. You see R&D in quantum technologies, which I mentioned earlier, is this is a sector that's new and has to have access to its own capabilities to improve its lot in life. And so it's no surprise that R&D in quantum technologies, quantum computing, and quantum information science was considered one of the most promising application areas. But as I mentioned earlier, cybersecurity now stands almost head and shoulders right alongside financial in terms of one of the most promising application areas. The key here, though, is as you move down this, you'll see that there is a lot of interest. Pharmaceuticals, computer-aided engineering, bioscience, aerospace, advanced manufacturing, lots and lots of interest. A breadth of coverage when it comes to the potential for quantum computing to serve a number of interesting advanced compute workloads and related applications. One of the things that I want to just cover quickly, this has almost become a certain amount of, I would say fancy, if you will, when we asked different quantum computing suppliers about the specter of quantum winter coming. This is the results that we got in 2020, the light blue lines, and then the purple was the lines that we got from this year. And what I found very interesting is that 43% see a quantum winter as somewhat or highly unlikely, versus only 30% when we asked this question last year. And what you'll see who's really bailed out, if you will, perhaps become a little more optimistic, is last year almost 27% of the survey respondents said that a quantum winter had a very high chance or was highly likely, and that number has dropped now down to about 12% of the respondents. So at a minimum, we can say that there is some real optimism going forward in the sector, and I think this is a very good thing, and hopefully this trend will continue as we go forward. Well, if this was really just a taste of the survey, there's lots and lots more details. If you have additional questions, if you have some comments, if you want to basically just weigh in on what you thought, how the study worked, or give some insights, or perhaps more importantly, make sure that you're on the survey list next year, drop me an email and we can certainly talk and figure out exactly how to answer your questions or make sure that you are part of this ongoing process as we move forward. So with that, I will thank everyone for their attention, their participation. I hope you have a great 3 days at Q2B. As I said, I'm sorry I can't be there. It's always one of my favorite conferences, and I'm sure everyone's going to have a great time. But at this point, I just want to end my little discussion, their attention and participation.